Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Fighting Matters. I've got my co-host Steve Kwan on. Steve, how are you doing today?
Doing good, buddy. How are you doing?
Surviving. It's a bit of a shock to be back from up north. Our guest today, though, I'm really excited about. So Derek's a friend, but Derek's also been a long-time science and health journalist. He's a martial art co-alumnus with me because he trained at the Inosanto Academy down in California, and so did I, at different times, but we have that bond. And most importantly for today's topic, he's one of the three co-hosts for the Conspirituality podcast. And I know the Conspirituality podcast was and continues to be a beacon of hope in an otherwise dreary landscape where many people who are from the left to the right think that they're going insane. So, Derek, I thought maybe you could explain the original premise of Conspirituality and why you guys started that, and sort of how conspiracy thinking isn't purely constrained to the alt-right.
Sure, and thanks for having me, and good seeing you as always. You are at least one-time guest on Conspirituality as well. The term itself comes from a 2011 academic paper that was written, it turns out, by a conspiracy theorist. She was actually promoting the idea. Her academic advisor, who co-wrote the paper with her, didn't realize that at the time, came out many years later, but it's very fascinating. And the term itself, she basically wrote it to talk about the ways that the right-wing, libertarian, predominantly male space mindset, pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality, hard right, individualistic politics, how it crosses over with the left-leaning, predominantly female wellness and new age spaces. And she talks about how this happened in the 1960s. John Birch Society is a great example because you have the Birchers coming out against vaccines and against fluoride. And then you have the hippies who are also against vaccines and against fluoride. So first off, to get to how we started the podcast, I had my own podcast called Earthrise for a number of years. That was just a number of my interviews that I was doing as a journalist. And then the pseudo-documentary Plandemic came out in May of 2020, and we were in lockdowns. I had been covering the anti-vax movement since 2014 when there was a measles outbreak in Los Angeles where I was living at the time. So through my health and science column, I had just been watching the anti-vax movement and its influence and how it was growing. And COVID was really the catalyst to mainstream it. So you have Plandemic come out, who was created by Mickey Willis, who is someone both myself and Julian, my co-host, had worked with in some small levels, but knew from the Los Angeles yoga scene. And I knew it was going to just take off because everyone was on their phones all the time. And I could just see the pattern. So I invited Matthew Remski and Julian Walker to come onto my old podcast. They did that for 2 consecutive weeks. And then we decided to take this term that I had found in February that year. A philosopher named Jules Evans had written a piece about it in Medium. And that's how I discovered and went back and read the original research paper. Julian, Matthew, and I all come from the wellness space as former or current, in Julian's case, yoga instructors. And we just felt compelled to talk about what was happening in the anti-vax space. So that's where it started. And it also answers the question of the fact that especially health conspiracies, but as we've learned, also political conspiracies, are not just right-leaning. The connective tissue, I believe, is individualism, which is a hyper-American concept, although other countries have their own forms of it. But America, since its founding, has always been about the individual and glorifying the individual. And I'm sure we can get into this, but that plays out in health spaces all the time because I know we'll get to RFK Jr., but everything that MAHA promotes right now is based on the idea that individual health is how you get healthy, which is simply not true. But that is sort of how they have mobilized whatever political part of the spectrum you're from, that is how they've mobilized people to come over to their cause.
We're taking anti-vax as the original conspiracy, I suppose, and I guess COVID denial as the original two conspiracies. And when this started coming into the yoga studio space and the associated health and personal wellness spaces, I've often had a theory that this is mostly driven or significantly driven by the fact that if your business was affected heavily by COVID, then you looked for rationales to keep your business open. And the first rationale was COVID can't be as bad as they say, because if it is as bad as they say, then I'm committing a crime and I'm doing something unethical. But if it's a hoax, or if it's way overblown, if it's just the flu, then I can ethically keep my yoga studio open. I can ethically keep my jiu-jitsu studio open. And that this was the original inception. And once you go down that route, well, who's lying to you? Well, the CDC is lying to you, the World Health Organization is lying to you, these people are lying to you. And then it gets... So I guess my point is, or my question is, wouldn't COVID denial come before vaccine denial or vaccine conspiracism in our collective spaces?
No, not at all. The first anti-vax movement started when people like Louis Pasteur was working on the first vaccines, which are called inoculations. Then there was this idea that you were going against God's will by trying to protect people and save their lives, because if God wanted them dead, then the disease would just run through them. And this is when miasma theory was the going theory of disease. I was just last week reviewing RFK's book, The Real Anthony Fauci, because he has a whole chapter on miasma theory. Like he believes that is true. The idea that the bad, noxious gases in the air are what actually create disease. He is a germ theory denialist, and he runs HHS, which is insane, but absolutely true. Part of the reason that COVID denialism was able to be such a force was because the anti-vax movement had laid the foundation for decades. It had never gone away. It's always been there, historically, always. But with Andrew Wakefield's falsified study in the 90s on the connection between autism and vaccines, that movement has been growing in influence even before COVID. And I mean, when RFK Jr. took over World Mercury Project and renamed it Children's Health Defense in 2018, they were increasing in donations every year leading up to 2020. And then it just blew up. Like the amount of money they started making in 2020 went from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars in donations every year. So I feel that because that movement, everything was there for them, they were able to take this opportunity of COVID and just insert themselves into the conversation, because pandemic comes out in May 2020. When is the first COVID vaccine hit the market? In December? So they were saying that it couldn't possibly work months before it had been developed. And as soon as they realized it was going to be used with mRNA technology, well, then they went on a frontal assault on mRNA, which they don't understand. But anytime any sort of information came out about what the vaccine would entail, they were ready to attack it before it even started. So when RFK goes in front of Congress last week and he says things like the CDC, we don't have data on how many people died from COVID, that is absolutely untrue. But part of the problem is certain states stopped tracking. They put different codings for deaths on certificates. Like, it was very muddled because the bureaucracy was being influenced by this sort of health libertarian movement at every step. So I think COVID denialism would have happened regardless of the anti-vax movement, but I think they really enabled it to get such political power and to affect the mainstream thinking so much quicker and so much broader at scale than otherwise they would have been able to.
No, I agree that the framework of anti-vax has been around since, we'll put some cartoons up that illustrate the point. This has been around for a while. but just in the martial arts spaces that I saw, the same people who were saying COVID is a hoax 3 months later were yelling and screaming about the vaccines got microchips and it's caused turbo cancer and it's some evil ploy. And I think for breaking through to public, like the explosion in COVID denialism out to, formerly normal people preceded, I think, the explosion in anti-vax out to normal people. I mean, Joe Rogan was losing his mind about COVID restrictions before he started becoming the biggest one of the biggest anti-vax mouthpieces on the planet.
I guess it depends on the spaces you're in. It's interesting because I was looking at QAnon from 2018 on, and QAnon at the beginning of the pandemic was really big on 5G, like anti-5G technology. But it's always my feeling that anything that gets your phone to run faster, people aren't going to care. Like they might like make a hay about it at first, but then it's like, oh, my app's open quicker. All right, I don't care about that. Then QAnon latched on to the anti-vax rhetoric, and then Plandemic came out. And so that was sort of more the space that I was in from the wellness side. I think that it was sort of simmering underlying all of what you're talking about. Specific to what you're referencing here, though, I think we were just in a space. I know personally, my wife and I, we lost 70% of our income, like in a day. Like on Sunday, I taught a kettlebell class and then a yoga class. And on Monday, I'm out of a job. And then she lost her job that week. And then we only have my freelance writing budget. And we were lucky to have something. A lot of people lost all their income. So if you're running a studio and you all of a sudden don't know how you're going to pay your rent or your mortgage, then I think the idea that it's not that bad, we need to get people in, makes a lot of sense to people who are really genuinely confused and all of a sudden they have nowhere to turn. That's a really interesting prospect, especially because the scientists and the researchers who are trying to figure out the disease, they are predominantly being honest about it, being like, we don't know what it is. We know it's this. We think we can do this. Whereas the people who are anti-lockdowns were very, very deterministic in what they were saying. They were like, it is this. We can't do this. It's just the flu. And when you start to form those parasocial bonds with people who are very certain about what they're saying, it's easy to be taken in by their rhetoric.
Well, I mean, today we're in this weird situation where we've got libertarian groups like the Cato Institute. I was just reading one of their position papers this morning. Meatheads like Joe Rogan, the head of Health and Human Services, RFK Jr., and the original conspiracy theorist, Alex Jones. And they're all basically singing off the same song sheet. Mm-hmm. It's kind of overwhelming to look at, just in terms of how many people died from COVID. Can you address that? Because you say, if any argument about the need for vaccines or the need for social distancing or the use of masks comes up, it always hinges on how bad was it. And all those people I just listed, they're all saying, yeah, maybe a couple people died from it, but way more people died from the vaccine.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with an anecdote with that because it just happened yesterday where I got into an old friend of mine had commented something on one of our Instagram posts. And then he was basically taking the side of COVID not being as bad as we thought it was. The funny thing about him specifically is that I remember he caught it before the first vaccine. And I remember talking to him because he was locked inside an apartment by himself for 10 days and he didn't know if he was going to live or not. He said it was the worst experience of his life. And he is now saying it wasn't that bad. So we have this sort of collective amnesia. I mean, you probably recognize this from martial arts with pain. When something happens and you're injured and you get an incredible amounts of pain, you're like, I'm never going to do that again. And then a couple of months later, you're better and you go back. Like that is built into the human psychology that I've seen like research written about the reason that women don't remember how horrible childbirth is in terms of pain levels is so we can keep procreating. Like that's just seems built into our psychology. And so we have over 1 million people dead in the US. And it was terrible. And not only was it terrible, it's still around. We're seeing an upsurge right now. We're seeing an upsurge as a number of states, you can only get a COVID vaccine with a prescription now. And anytime you put like a roadblock on the way to getting a vaccine, you're going to have attrition. Like more and more people are just going to say, I don't want to have to call my doctor. I don't want to go there. I don't want to do all that. I'll just wing it. It is still being studied right now how bad long-term multiple infections will be for people when it comes to things like dementia and different cognitive problems, when it comes to immune problems, when it comes to chronic disease. Because one of the things that gives people chronic disease, and I'm mentioning that because that's RFK Jr.'s big thing, is he wants to combat chronic disease, are viruses. Viruses lead to chronic disease. If you get infected multiple times, you can get a chronic disease because of it. And unfortunately, we're in a situation where that's been weaponized to the point of they will just do everything to say it's something else. It's a food dye. It's a seed oil, whatever it is. They'll distract attention from the fact that we need good public health interventions right now. And we're not getting it from the public health agencies because they have weaponized that rhetoric for so long. So when he sits in front of Congress and we don't know how many people, and the senators are like, you run the agency, how do you not know? They are being honest that he should know, and he does know. He does have that data available. He's just lying at that point.
What about his point that is supposedly that the data was too corrupted and too fragmented to know that we can't trust any of the data coming out? How do we know how many people died? And this is pretty central to the idea. Now, I will admit the early numbers that came out about COVID had infection fatality rates of about 3%. In the end, after all, the dust settled in the States, you're looking at an infection fatality rate of roughly 0.5%-ish. So it's a lot less deadly than it was. Of course, the fact that most of the vulnerable people got vaccinated at least once did a lot to cut down on those infection fatality rates. So how do we know what the death total was, or ballpark what it was?
Yeah, I mean, to be specifically, it's very difficult to track. In the US, the states, they don't always talk to each other very well. I mean, we are 50 different islands that are trying to work together as a nation. And so one state might have exceptional tracking in public health, and we know that other states just stop tracking. And so how do you get an actual number from that is extremely difficult. And the fact that since RFK Jr. took control, a number of state departments have tracked even less. Like they've stopped tracking for bird flu, for example. And so you're looking at something that could be the next pandemic. It's possible. And states aren't even looking at it anymore. They stopped tracking measles rates and cases in certain states. And so we have the worst outbreak since eradication in 2000. And a few states are like, we're not even going to look at it anymore. So when RFK, so maybe he's not actually lying, but he is when he says under Biden, we wouldn't have the data. We had better data then. Now, I don't know what sort of data I can trust coming out of his agencies.
I think in the last 6 months, we can basically no longer take any data coming from the United States government seriously, whether they're economic figures, job numbers, inflation numbers, or measles numbers. Steve, unless you jump in here, people are going to think that you're just sitting there mulling about us being big pharma shills.
Yeah. I am preparing my angry tweets in response to this podcast right now, Stephan. No, it's the weird thing about being in the martial arts is just seeing how aggressively and with how much hostility people responded to COVID. I mean, there's a lot of things you can introduce into the martial arts that will be met with pushback. I mean, Stephan, I know you and I have talked about this, right? Whenever we do content that exposes things like sexual abuse in jiu-jitsu, there will always be pushback. But a lot of that is kind of the agree to disagree type of pushback. But when you start talking about vaccination, you get met with this level of hostility that is just unbelievable. I mean, just the other day, I posted a relatively what I thought was a fair and objective statement that, like, hey, you know, if we want to be rational thinkers, we should be vaccinated, and here's why, and it should be okay to talk about this. And I mean, some of the anger that I got back from that was just completely unbelievable. And of course, these are people who have no scientific basis for their anger. They have no personal experience doing the research, so they really don't have the right to have such a strong opinion about this, but yet of course they do. And there's something about vaccination that really draws out the ire in a lot of people. I think it's because, like you said, Derek, it's easy to spin up just the worst conspiracies around vaccines and paint them as just this incredibly evil, scary thing. And the people who profit off of this have done an amazing job of creating that propaganda. And in our mutual circles, right, basically the wellness fitness space, it's a complete just infestation of people who buy into that toxic anti-science mindset.
Predominantly coming from the yoga world, there's a real misunderstanding of personal privilege that exists there from a number of people, not from everyone. I think most people who practice are doing it for great reasons and don't get caught up in all of this. But when you get to the top tier of influencers, they will never understand how they've benefited from the social determinants of health. They will never take the time to recognize that estimates between 40 and 60% of individual health is determined by the social determinants, which are things like your education level, your access to healthcare, your access to nutrition, your environment. Like, it's been shown that people who live under flight paths of airplanes generally have higher rates of cancer, and those are usually lower income neighborhoods that are directly under the flight paths. All of those factor into individual health. And then that creates long-term genetic health as people, as generations move on. If your family never leaves that area, if you never are able to move up the ladder, which in America hasn't happened in 2 generations now, social mobility, then it's going to be very hard to get out of that cycle, and that will affect your individual health. So from the wellness space, a lot of the people who are selling the products for individual health and talking about doing the anti-vax, doing the COVID denialism, doing the anti-food dye, anti-seed oil, pro-nicotine patch is a big one now, anti-sunscreen, all of that, they don't understand that they are the beneficiaries of good determinants that have helped them along the way, because people... I'll speak for Americans. Americans broadly, they don't like to believe they've been helped in any way. There's this real ethos of, I've done this myself, and I am healthy because of these things. I see a lot of that in the yoga space, and then in our audience, we have the people in those spaces who understand that, and they understand they are the beneficiaries. But we see a lot of people in our audience who have suffered from multiple chronic diseases through no fault of their own. They're not lazy. They didn't gain weight because they didn't have a strong enough willpower. Like, there are many different reasons for poor health outcomes. And that sort of conversation never happens in MAHA spaces. I don't know if it's the same. I have trained in different martial arts, but I haven't devoted myself like you guys have. So I haven't spent enough time in those spaces to understand the sort of mindsets that permeate there.
Oh, it's hugely... The mythology is always, I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps, and then I'm connected to some mystical lineage, which also, gives me insights. But it's kind of amazing when I watch RFK Jr. talking about how America is the sickest, highest levels of chronic disease of anywhere in the world, how you can do that, and then essentially blaming on social determinants. It's the state adding fluoride. It's the state doing vaccine mandates. So social determinants are bad. The thing that's going to make you healthy, is exercise, doing pull-ups, hitting the Zins nicotine pouches, And for the love of God, don't consider why chronic disease might be related to essentially a cratered healthcare system that's getting worse by the day.
Well, first off, doing half chin-ups, because RFK, I've never seen him do a pull-up. He's doing chin-ups. But I as a former longtime fitness instructor, I never like to talk negatively about people's workouts. Like, my job was to help them get better. But when you're presenting yourself as the icon of health and you're saying do these things and you can't do them properly, I think you're open to a lot of criticism at that point. They are very, he does occasionally hit upon correct things. And he does talk about the damages of the food industry, which are true, but it goes well beyond a food dye. A food dye is predominantly inconsequential. You have to talk about the supply chain. You have to talk about the infrastructure and neighborhoods. I once did a sort of overlay on my Substack about looking at the highest poverty levels in America, the least amount of healthcare access, the least amount of food, good nutrition access, so food deserts, and then the highest incidence of chronic disease. Where are those places? It's the same map. It is, you can literally overlay them and they will be the same thing. So the American South, especially Southeast, but going into Texas, it's all in the red, all those things I just said. And then as you go throughout the country, it's still in spots. The coastal elites that the right likes to wave their hands about all the time, they have the best healthcare access, the best nutrition access, the highest incomes. So you see these patterns. He'll put it on the food industry. He'll take benefits away from SNAP recipients, like getting soda or candy or things, but he's not replacing it. He says he's going to. He says you're going to go to farmers markets now. He's not actually going into those neighborhoods to help those people achieve better health outcome. And the problem is, I know at the end of his tenure, chronic disease rates are going to be worse than what they even are now. But because he controls the data, we're not going to find out about that. And so it's really mind-boggling what they're doing, because first off, everything they're doing is based off the Project 2025 playbook. They would not have brought in Kennedy to go wild if he wasn't going to be for deregulation and for cutting social services. He is for both of those things. He is pro-capitalist. He said people don't want socialized medicine. He said that for years. So he is the perfect pawn for them in that place. And that's partly why, even with all of the sort of media chaos around what he's doing, they're just letting him stay because he's serving their means right now.
Yeah. I saw or heard another influencer talking about this recently, and I think it was just last night. They said something to the effect of, RFK Jr. talks about health and nutrition like a rich guy does. And that's true, right? He talks about things from the perspective of someone who has endless means and resources to access the best nutrition, the best health care. They have the time to work out like a fiend. And the challenge that I find with a lot of the like pro-fitness anti-vaxxers is they come at things from this perspective of like, well, I am young, I am healthy, I have no major health issues, I have devoted my entire life to basically working out in the gym. And they have a shocking, especially for someone who is supposed to be a trainer, they have a shocking level of empathy for people who are not in their situation, for people who have serious health considerations or don't have the money to basically be sitting there working out 3 hours a day and only eating the finest natural healthy stuff, right? There is zero empathy for people without means. And that lack of empathy is something that has really stood out to me in the anti-vax MAHA space, and it's really disturbing, honestly.
The lack of empathy is a big one, and I've seen that. So we talked about the Anti-Vax Foundation, but the whole Health Privilege Foundation, I began practicing yoga in the 90s, and even then you would hear rhetoric like, no one knows your body better than you. You're your own best doctor. Food is medicine. Like that stuff that has existed for a long time. And what happens in those spaces is that people who get indoctrinated into that sort of rhetoric, and just to be clear, I make this a lot of caveats on my own work a lot, but I am all for being as healthy as possible. Like, I work out 6 to 7 days a week. I don't have children, so I'm afforded the opportunity to be able to do that, and the income with my wife to be able to spend more money on food than a lot of people. And I take advantage of all of that because I like living a healthy lifestyle. But then if I were to go and think that everyone has the same exact opportunities that I do, that's what happens, is that people get caught up in that. They're well enough off time-wise, financially, and all those things that they don't have to worry about where their next meal comes from. And they can't possibly put themselves in the shoes of people who don't have those sorts of privileges. And those are the people who are predominantly going to be affected by all of the things that RFK Jr. is identifying, because he's not wrong that we have the most chronic disease incidence in the industrialized world. Like, there are a bunch of island nations that have worse rates, but they are not considered, more industrialized. But first of all, it's not that big. It's a few percentage points over European nations. It's not like we're quadruple other nations. Sometimes, like, when he talks about incidents of being overweight, which is done on a horrible metric through BMI in the first place, which doesn't really tell you anything about health. But when he does that, we're always just edging out other countries. So one thing I always do is, anytime he makes a claim, it doesn't take that long to look into it. And I know a lot of people aren't going to do that, especially if you're an RFK stan. You're just going to take him at his word. But if you go and just look up like the incidence of being overweight or chronic disease in other nations, you'll see we're just over the top. So that says something about our global systems, but it also says something about the rhetoric that he's pushing, because of essentially what he's doing is he's creating an environment where him and his friends are going to be enriched. There's a reason that MAHA is just a MAGA ripoff. It's the same thing, just focused on health instead of immigration and global politics.
So how is MAHA going to make these guys rich? It's pretty obvious how MAGA has made people rich. I mean, from insider trading to launching sneakers to Bitcoin.
Oh, that reminds me,
scams
Stephan, we got to get on that shit coin that we said we were going to release. Remember on that April Fool's? We were going to do a jiu-jitsu shit coin and get billions off this. We got to get to that.
Definitely on the to-do list for next year. So we've seen how MAGA enriches people. How does MAHA enrich people?
Okay, so be clear, this is all my personal speculation, having just immersed myself in this world for years, but it's pretty clear to me how the pieces are coming together right now. One of the heuristics I came up with early in Conspirituality was watch what they say and then watch what they sell. So what you have is, let's just take Mark Hyman, for example, because I cover him a lot. You will have him in...
Who is Mark Hyman for people who don't know?
Mark Hyman is a functional medicine doctor. He is a family physician. He was at Cleveland Clinic for a long time. He didn't invent the idea of functional medicine, but he became sort of the leading figure in it. Functional medicine is just the idea that they're really looking for the root cause of disease, the etiology of disease, as if, and they will literally say this, they will say Western medicine doesn't look for the root cause, they only treat symptoms, which is absolutely untrue. So he makes $28 million a year as of 2024 selling supplements and diet books and all the stuff that he sells. He now runs a company called Function Health, which you can send for $500 a year. You can send in your blood work and they will run 200 useless tests to tell you a bunch of shit you don't really need to know. But it's this idea that you're being very proactive about your health. So Mark Hyman will go on, say, Barry Weiss's podcast, which he did a few months ago, and he's not explicitly anti-vax. He's very polished. He's a very good speaker. He's slightly charismatic. And he will say things like, we don't know if all of these different vaccines are having a cumulative effect that are causing all of these diseases. Well, we do know that multiple vaccines don't have a cumulative effect. There's never been any proof that that's actually a thing. But he presents it in such a clear and just calm manner as being like, we've never done this sort of test on all these different things. And then he will turn around and you'll get roped into his funnel and you'll be on his email list, and you will be inundated with hundreds of different supplements and blood tests and sales and things of that nature. So Function Health is current, like, sort of Silicon Valley darling, because their first round, they raised a lot of money. They're having, from my understanding, they're having a little more problem with their Series B, but they are very much on the optimization tip. It's not just about being healthy. It's about being better than healthy. I mean, that's what wellness essentially is that you're not just surviving, you are thriving. That's the concept. And so Function Health wants to put you into that anti-aging bracket, that you can live longer and better because of these probably useless supplements. Well, Mark Hyman is one of Kennedy's best friends, and he has visited the White House, and he has been among a cohort of different tech, wearable, and supplement companies that have been meeting with Kennedy. And what I think is next this fall is public-private partnerships. Kennedy has already said he wants every American to have a wearable in the next couple years. And so what happens besides data collection and that nightmare that could happen is this idea that, well, wearables are not cheap. My Garmin watch is $250. An Oura ring is $500 for the high-level one. He wants to start to create these public-private partnerships with these companies to get them government contracts. And we've already seen that. Oura Rings just last week announced they're a Finnish company, but they are opening their first factory in Texas because their work with the Department of Defense is ramping up, and they just signed a contract with Palantir, Peter Thiel's company.
Department of War? I believe there's been a rebranding recently.
You're right.
Got to get that right, man. Got to get that right. Get on the same page here.
I can't keep up with all the agency changes. So these are indications that these sorts of deals are going to be happening. So on the government level, you're going to have these companies getting these big deals, and then the trickle-down effects are just all the MAHA influencers who are getting more and more media time in right-wing spaces, who are, Food Babe, who is at the White House sometimes, like consulting with them. They're going to be getting deals, and that some of them are happening, like the Oura Ring one that's already been done. I feel that more and more of those are going to be happening, and that's how the wellness alt med space becomes more lucrative.
Derek, I don't know if you get these emails because due to the nature of your podcast, you're kind of directly antithetical to this, but running a martial arts podcast, I get a lot of pitches from people who want to shill whatever crazy supplement they've got. And I mean, I've always said I'm happy to take a sponsor, but you got to prove to me that this stuff actually works. And most of the pitches that I get are clearly, there's no evidence to believe that they would work at all, right? But I can understand how if you're running a small YouTube channel and you're broke and someone comes to you and says, hey, if you sell my, mushroom powder, then all of a sudden, you have an income stream. These health influencers are super vulnerable to that. And Stephan, I really like how you brought up, you always have to ask yourself, like, what is the financial motivation for why these people are doing this stuff? And oftentimes it comes down to the fact that, I mean, if you've ever watched any sort of online fitness content, you will get inundated with these influencer ads for various protein powders or whatever. And of course, you're now wading into a market, the supplement market, which is wildly unregulated. And so for all of the hate that people sometimes rightfully throw on the, big pharma, right, the evil big pharma, at the end of the day, there are, or at least there used to be, regulations intended to constrain them and to, they are the focus of regulation because the government understands how important it is to get health right. Supplements and the health influencers who shill them have no such restrictions on their ethical behavior. And so when you wind up trusting those people over the actual medical experts, what you're doing, it's not just about big pharma versus whatever, but you're also moving into an area now where there is a lot less oversight, making sure these people are doing the right thing. You are way more likely to have a bad experience just buying rando supplements off of a YouTuber than you are actually getting medicine. And Stephan, you on a previous episode busted the big pharma myth anyway. People talk about big pharma like it's this Illuminati style cabal running the world. I mean, it is a massive industry, But the general fitness industry, where things like supplements fall into, is an order of magnitude bigger. And that industry, despite being so large, flies under the regulation radar, and people can get seriously hurt taking these pills. But the big challenge that I see, especially in health, as you touched on earlier, Derek, is sometimes cause and effect is not obvious, right? It's not like if sometimes, maybe you don't take the vaccine, it's not like you're immediately going to regret it the day after. It could be some downstream impact that maybe it doesn't even impact you directly. Maybe it impacts your kids or your loved ones directly. You don't see it directly. And as you guys pointed out, there's this individualistic run bent in the health and fitness sectors, where people like to believe that it's all about what they do themselves. And so sometimes it's hard to show people the accountability and the results of their actions. I find that's kind of one of the most frustrating things with dealing with martial arts people, especially. It would be one thing if they just said, hey, we don't want to talk about vaccines or autism or sunscreen or any of this because that's out of our wheelhouse. Okay. But they will, on one hand, condemn these proven technologies while simultaneously selling their shitty protein powder, which who the hell knows what's even in it, right? So that level of moral hypocrisy is really the challenging and the frustrating thing that I find working in the sport sometimes.
Absolutely. We have guardrails on the podcast. We've been approached by a number of supplement companies wanting to advertise, and we've said no. We have an agency who handles our ads, and we have exclusionary categories, like gambling is one. We don't allow gambling ads. We don't allow any supplements ads and sponsorships, anything of that nature. And I'm not even, I take supplements. I'm not anti-supplement. But when it comes to our actual coverage of influencers, because you're right, there are a lot of yoga. So one of the things that really pushed supplements over was COVID, because it became an income stream for people who could no longer teach in person anymore. And if you are a small yoga instructor, and by I mean you don't really have a social media presence, you have a few thousand followers, and you're saying, hey, I take this gummy and it makes me feel better, I would personally never cover that. Because it's just okay, that may or may not be true, but why am I going to bother? If you're someone out there with hundreds of thousands, millions of followers, you're saying vaccines don't work, but this does, so take this magnesium supplement, then that's when, to me, it falls into coverage area, because that is the real malicious element here that's happening. And you're absolutely right. I've done multiple episodes on AG1. And there's a thing called adaptogens, which are just mushrooms, but they needed a fancy term for them. And they're supposed to do all these magical things. And mushrooms are definitely healthy as a food, but, it's questionable how much powders do for you. And then I started looking into all the adaptogens that, are supposedly in AG1, and they are contraindicated for diabetes medication and blood thinners and SSRIs. All sorts of anti-anxiety medications are contraindicated to adaptogens. You will not find that on AG1's website anywhere. I mean, I was in a New York Magazine piece about this, about the Huberman scandal, but I was talking about AG1. And I reached out to them. They didn't provide any information about contraindications. Now, with AG1 specifically, there's probably so little of it because it's mostly fiber by weight. So it probably doesn't make a difference. But if someone's on a diabetes medication and they're told this supplement could do good things and they start taking it, exactly, that is an instance of a cumulative effect if they keep taking it. And the supplements companies will only ever be held to account if multiple people die taking it, and then they get a letter. They're never taken to court. So we are in a completely skewed environment toward them, regulatory wise. And again, just to add a caveat, I am not a fan of the pharmaceutical industry. I'm not a fan of for-profit medicine. America is the only industrialized nation that doesn't have a widespread socialized medicine net for everyone. And it's horrendous. And it leads to the environment that Kennedy is criticizing all the time. And instead of actually addressing that, he won't. So it's a very frustrating situation to try to because you said pharma shill before, Stephan, and it's no, I like medications. I'm a cancer survivor. I'm kind of lucky. But at the same time, I don't like the system that's putting it out. And so trying to like have those conversations is very difficult.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of difficult conversations and unraveling them, could you explain for me how basically in the same 24-hour period you have RFK saying that, yes, Donald Trump does deserve a Nobel Prize for Operation Warp Speed, which developed mRNA vaccines, and some variation on there are no vaccines that are safe and effective, and it probably didn't save any lives during COVID. I'm confused. Please explain.
My feeling is that he spent so long from his, lawyer days as with the water supply and the and I want to point out, everyone's always like he was an environmental champion. Yeah, he was bringing forth lawsuits against companies that were polluting. Good thing, but he was also spinning up his own bottled water company at the same time and selling it. So he's been in on this game for a long time, to be super clear. My feeling on that specific question is that he has spent so long not being held to account. He's a Kennedy. He has a ton of money, has all the resources he needs. He's surrounded himself with a lot of yes people. So you go back 2015, 2018, when he starts Children's Health Defense, 2019, even 2022, 2023, he is speaking to his audience. He is not being challenged. Now, all of a sudden, he's in front of Congress where people aren't playing that game. He does not know, he is not slick enough to know how to navigate that space. And so in that other place where he is considered a minor deity, he can be contradictory, and they're not going to hold him to account because it's all vibes based. He's making them feel something. But now you're up against doctors who have spent decades in the craft, and they're Congress people, and they know what they're talking about. He doesn't know how to navigate that space. So you'll watch him. Not even in 24 hours, you'll watch. I mean, that's the thing. Oh man, I'm forgetting his name right now. Bill Cassidy, who could have denied his entry or his nomination, who is a physician, but he went to college with Kennedy and they're longtime friends. So he gets him through. I'll never forgive him for that, but good on him for saying, do you think Donald Trump deserves a Nobel? And him say he caught him, he trapped him. And that was such a clear indication. And what happens, I mean, Kennedy fumbled his way through that congressional hearing. And then that night he goes on Fox talking about what a victory he had and how all the people that questioned him don't really want Americans to be healthy, because that is the space he operates in. But actually challenge him to his person. He doesn't know how to handle that.
So this is the thing that really scares me, and I'm glad that you guys are touching on this because I wanted to make sure we got to that. I know it's kind of become a trope to say that it just feels like facts don't matter at this point, but I think it's a bit beyond that. I mean, a lot of these people, it's not just that facts don't matter to them, it's that they're actively making a mockery of facts and of truth and of justice. We talked about this on a different episode recently with another guy about how, a big part of this particular style of government that they're deploying seems to be to just make a mockery of the whole system so that people lose faith in it. And I mean, how can someone simultaneously say that Donald Trump deserves a Nobel Prize for Operation Warp Speed while also saying the vaccines don't work and they kill people? Well, I mean, if you don't care about the truth, you can say whatever you want. And, when the pandemic was happening, there was a lot of pushback from within the martial arts community about getting vaccinated. And obviously, I mean, the science proves that those people were wrong in their beliefs. But at least in the throes of a pandemic with a new vaccine, I can at least understand why someone might at least be skeptical or afraid of getting that. I mean, again, you might be wrong. The data's proven that out. But I can understand why in the heat of that moment, the scariest time that a lot of these people have ever been alive, they might hesitate before getting the shot. But I would expect that, 5 years into this now, that you would, if you take a look at the data and you believe that vaccines don't work, you would just take a mea culpa and say, you know what, I'm going to take the L on this. I was clearly wrong. Let's move on with our lives. What has been really scary to me is how these people, rather than just accepting the facts and the truth, they've chosen to specifically vote to elect people and put into power people who will change the truth to what they want it to be. Right? I mean, the big thing that RFK Jr. represents is we are so offended by the truth that these vaccines work that we are going to put a complete charlatan in the Department of Health. And we are going to put them in charge specifically so that they can redefine the data and the science so that it confirms to our beliefs. I have some people I know who are anti-vaxxers, and, when they started cutting, mRNA funding, and they started putting all of this stuff into place, they were all of these people were sending me these messages and taking a victory lap. Like, see, I was proven right, Steve. All this time I said the vaccines don't work. Well, look, the science has caught up with me. It's like, no, you just voted for someone who would tell you what you wanted to hear because it conformed with your existing beliefs. And this is the scary thing. I noticed a change in the way that people talk about vaccines just over the past few years. Stephan, you probably noticed this as well, where anti-vaxxers in the martial arts space started specifically talking about how, we were proven right. It was proven that vaccines don't work. No one died from COVID. Way more people died from the vaccines. This is all known now. It's been completely proven. And it's like, God, you guys are completely out to lunch. Everything you're saying is the opposite of what was actually proven. But you've redefined reality to align with what you want to be true. And that is the scary thing, because I don't know how we come back from that, right? I mean, it's one thing.
I don't know how we exit the mirror world, which is what this is.
Yeah, it's one thing to have a bunch of anti-vaxxers that we got to deal with and we got to try to educate them or get them on the same page. It's another thing when they are now using their power as a voting bloc to redefine reality. Like, how do we come back from that?
First, I want to point out that everything that's happening now is just a more malicious reboot of Reaganomics. It really started then. I mean, as soon as FDR started implementing New Deal social safety nets, the right has been trying to dismantle them. They were unsuccessful for a while, and then Nixon happened, and then we had a bit of a reprieve with Carter, and then Reagan happened. And since then, it's been more and more deregulatory. And so I'm paraphrasing, but he said, what's the scariest thing you can hear? I'm here from the government and I can help you. The Heritage Foundation playbook, which Trump is running under, is just that. It's this idea that you can't. I mean, because Kennedy does it and Trump does it, they're constantly playing like they're the victims and they're the underdogs when they have total and absolute power at this point. They're still pretending that they don't. So you can have Kennedy sitting there and saying the CDC doesn't have the data. And it's like, you run the CDC. Like, you can make this happen, but you're pretending you're powerless as if it's this thing that's nebulous and outside of your scope. And so, unfortunately, how do we come back? I mean, I just think humans are generally much more reactive than proactive. We like to think, the whole MAHA movement is built on this idea of being proactive with your health, but humans are reactive animals. And I think we're going to see some sort of, tragedy of a magnitude we can't even understand at this point, whether that's a virus, whether that's polio, whether it's something that has been here and is eradicated, or whether it's something that was found in the Siberian tundra and it comes out because of climate change. Like, something is going to happen that's going to so shake the public to understand that we need actual scientific intervention. And I don't know if that happens in a generation or multiple. I don't know if I see that in my life at this point. But, I like to try to be optimistic and hopeful about things. But the path we're walking on right now, we need such a swerve towards even New Deal policies on steroids. I'm not a full socialist, but I am a social democrat, so I do believe that a lot more socialized services need to happen. But in this environment, including with the Democratic Party, because look how they're acting around Zohran Mamdani in New York, I don't see how that happens, because it has to happen at a regulatory level. It's not going to be people mobilizing and doing it themselves. You can do that for your community and for yourself, sure, but on a social level, it has to happen on a policy platform, and I see no inkling of that happening from any party at this point.
I was just in a small rural museum in Drumheller, Alberta. So Drumheller has got the most amazing paleontology museum It's an amazing dinosaur museum. I've been there so many times. I love it. And then there's a small rural museum of farming implements, and I went in there for some reason, and they had an iron lung. And it's like, okay, I guess we're going to be seeing more of these in the future. You know, it really is almost a full generation since polio was a big thing. But I've met polio survivors. They were crippled. I saw a polio survivor from Africa in a hotel on that same trip, in that same hotel that I was staying in to go to the in Drumheller. And it's like, okay, we're going to be seeing more of like this young African guy, 20, 30 years old, with a gimped hand and a gimped leg. And we're going to be seeing more of these iron lungs.
My aunt is a polio survivor. She's still alive in her 70s, but she's worn a colostomy bag since a teenager because of it. Like, and you know, you don't want to, and I have to say this, it's a pattern I've noticed with that I think part of what explains why Kennedy and MAHA have been successful is because we were talking about rewriting COVID narratives. I think they've been able to help people rewrite their own health narratives. So there's somebody who's been on our feed on Instagram a few times and very cordial. I truly believe he is skeptical of vaccines. I don't think he's an anti-vax because he writes long, thoughtful DMs as well as comments. But he just talks about how he was injured by the COVID vaccine. So one day we had a number of conversations, but one day I go and I look on his feed and I go back to 2019 and 2020 before the vaccine. And he's talking about having the same health problems that he now attributes to the vaccine. And I've never brought that up with him. I haven't seen him in a while on our feed. But I think that has happened to some amount of people, that this idea that this one thing is the cause of all your problems has given them a framework for being like, that's it. And it mobilizes them. And I think that's really unfortunate, but I think Kennedy is really good on preying on vulnerable people in those situations. I mean, wellness generally is, because if you're generally healthy, you're not going to be taken in by a wellness influencer scam. But if you're feeling off, if you have something going on, if you're not quite sure, if you have something that doctors haven't been able to help you figure out, then what they're selling is very seductive. And to be completely honest, in some cases, I believe that some people have gotten supplements that have actually helped them. I do not doubt that. But we have tons of DMs and comments from people who wasted thousands of dollars on alt med products that were worse off afterwards. And I know I mentioned this to you, but I have a piece coming out in the New York Times tomorrow, as of tomorrow in the recording date, but this week. And we've talked to people who have lost loved ones because they decided to follow medical medium and do celery juice instead of chemotherapy, and their sibling died. That's a real thing too. And preying on that and preying on those people, I think, is one of the worst aspects of the work that I do, like seeing that.
The heuristic that you've brought up before, which is watch what they say, or listen to what they say and then watch what they sell, has been very useful for me. One of our co-hosts on this show, who's not here today, Jeff Shaw, has said, let's see if I can get this right, every complex problem has a simple, common sense solution that's absolutely wrong. So, you have some complex health problem, and if you can just point the finger at something, even if it came after the problem started, somehow this guy's COVID vaccination traveled back in time and affected him from 2019 onwards, when the vaccines only became available end of 2020, early 21. That's a simple solution to what is undoubtedly a complex problem.
Well, Andrew Wakefield set that playbook. I mean, he hand-selected the children in his vaccine cause autism study for kids who had GI or stomach problems. So they already had the issues, and then he brought them into the study. So this is not a new phenomenon, unfortunately. It's not how science works, but it is how people are able to weaponize the anti-science, anti-health sentiment.
Yeah, you know what it reminds me of, Stephan, I know we've talked about this. I don't know if there's an official name for this, but there's this kind of a certainty heuristic or certainty bias that I've observed with a lot of these people who kind of operate in these like scam adjacent industries, where they will always, first of all, speak with incredible certainty about what they're selling. And then they will also often, when it comes to presenting their ideas, they will often frame it in the sense of like holistic or common sense. Kind of like this vague idea, this big picture idea. And you'll hear even Donald Trump say this, right? Where people will confront him and say like, you know, sir, the data showing that your tariffs are costing jobs in America, what makes you think that this is a good idea? And you say, I just have a lot of common sense. I got common sense, you know. And you hear the same thing from, again, you talked about, holistic medicine, holistic nutrition. That's kind of like this, like, well, we don't need to talk about the specific science. I'm a big picture guy, right? You hear a lot of that. Chiropractors also do the same thing where they talk about, oh, no, we treat holistically. And I think that allows them to avoid getting specific enough that they actually have to present a case. Right? It's easy to just say, well, your data about this medicine is interesting, but I'm a holistic guy. I'm about making your life better in general. Well, now you're kind of just talking in the clouds, and it's a lot harder to pin down your bullshit when you're doing that. I find that to be one of the things that maybe attracts people to these kinds of scammers and grifters, because when you are experiencing a crisis and you're desperate for a solution, and your doctor, because they're an expert, they aren't sure, right? They're not going to speak with complete clarity because they're an expert. It's really appealing when all of a sudden your chiropractor says, you know what? I know the answer. It's that vaccine. That's what it is, right? Finally, someone's given me an answer. I can work with that. And I think that kind of scam just preys on our human need to have answers, even when they're not readily available.
It's common sense that if you have heart problems, you should eat desiccated heart tissue from the Liver King. It's common sense that if you have brain cancer, you should eat walnuts, because walnuts look like a brain. And it's common sense that if you have erectile dysfunction, you should eat nothing but eggplant. Or maybe that's gay and that's bad. I'm not sure. But
one of the phenomenon I've seen over the last decade is yoga instructors, specifically in Los Angeles when I lived there. They would do ayahuasca like once or twice, and then they would become shamans, and they would start offering psychedelic therapy. And chiropractors have that syndrome. I mean, I'm not anti-chiropractic. I actually have gone to hundreds of sessions. I no longer do, but like I had a lot of mobility issues that were eventually treated through proper physical therapy, but back then I didn't know that. So I relied on chiropractic, and they seem to be the most susceptible to pseudoscience. And that seems baked in because in the 20s there was the straight chiropractic and reform. And there are still there are reform chiropractors who work within the scope of physical therapy. You can judge whether or not it works. But the straight chiropractic, I mean, it was literally invented by a guy who believed he was adjusting ghosts. So that pseudoscience permeates, and they seem exceptionally confident that their bullshit is true out of most disciplines, I have to say. And there's kind of a game that I see on my social networks with all the public health officials and doctors. When someone says something, the comments are initially like, oh, you're a chiropractor before you look. And like 90% of the time, it's true.
So, Derek, I'm going to do my best to get this out Tuesday, September 9th, which is tomorrow, which is the same day that your New Yorker piece comes out. Can you tell us about that piece?
New York Times. It's
New York Times.
Yes. It's so I was approached by them last November after Trump won, asking me to write an opinion piece about MAHA and what I think it's going to do. And so I gave them my pitch, and somebody from the video team saw it and was thinking about doing a sort of video that talks about how MAHA wellness influencers radicalize people and make them anti-medicine. And that's what we've done. We've spent the last 8 months working on that. We've analyzed over 12,000 podcasts and videos, and we found almost 800 instances where people directly in the MAHA sphere say, don't trust your doctor, don't take chemotherapy, like don't trust Western medicine, like very clearly make these claims. So we just sort of map out how it happens. We do it through the image of a funnel, which is where I started before, where I think most people go to wellness with great intentions. And I think the predominant amount of people who might take a supplement or go to yoga classes or whatever it is, they're never going to get radicalized into this. But enough people are, and we're seeing sort of declining vaccination rates across the nation. So we know it's having an impact. So we just lay out the playbook, how it happens, the sort of rhetoric they use. And we talked to 4 different people. I think 3 of them were Conspirituality listeners that the Times flew into New York to do the recordings with. I had put out a call on our Patreon and, got dozens of people like responding. So a couple of them got to go and tell their story. So you hear about people who've been harmed by these wellness practices and the sort of anti-science rhetoric they espouse. 3 of them got through on the other side, positively because of it. One of them lost her sister, as I mentioned earlier. It's a 17-minute documentary about that. If it should be coming out tomorrow, as far as I know.
Talk about an asymmetry in effort, right? It takes you 8 months to put together a 17-minute piece. Yet you take some of these MAHA influencers and you give them one factoid and they can spin that out across 95 podcasts and they never shut up.
Ironically, I'll do a little self-promotion, but this weekend, Saturday's Conspirituality brief. So we have a Thursday main episode and then on Saturdays, we each release a brief. I am going to talk about the process. I mean, I put over 100 hours myself into this project, and I know the rest of the team, which touched well over a dozen different people involved in creating this. It took hundreds of hours of labor to create this video. And I talk about that as compared to wellness influencers who just make things up on the spot and they never suffer repercussions from it.
Yeah, I guess the thing that I would ask then is just, I mean, a lot of people who are kind of like-minded to us are feeling completely overwhelmed right now, but what can we even do about this? And it feels like there's so little that can be done when, you've got Robert F. Kennedy Jr. running Health and Human Services. It feels like an overwhelming problem. From your work, is there anything that is actionable that you recommend just regular folks do? Like, what can regular people do? And I'm not even just talking about, shoring up their health, but I also mean, if a person is scared of the direction that the world is going in today, what's the most effective way that just a regular Joe or Jane can push back and make a difference against this stuff?
I don't think individuals can create systemic change on that level unless they're voted into power. So if you're just talking about the pedestrian usage of this, what I do think they can do is they can help people within their direct vicinity. And that's the best you have. I mean, we have seen evidence. We've had over the years a few dozen people who were either skeptical or anti-vax DM us saying they are now pro-vaccine because of the people we've interviewed, the experts we've brought on. So, whatever platform you have, it could be useful, but I still think that we are social animals. No matter how much this screen gives us the illusion of being everywhere, we are still beholden to the people closest to us in our lives. And so trying to help them navigate their spaces is really important. So if you have someone who might be falling down that rabbit hole, it's first listening to them and actually feeling their concerns. I understand why you'd be confused about a shot you don't know anything about if you don't have the information. So actually listening to their concerns and then attending to them is very useful. And on a personal level, and to preface this, I'm going to talk about AI, but I wrote a piece last year for Mother Jones about how LLMs are already like fueling health misinformation because of where they pull from, because they'll pull from a lot of wellness sites. So that is a real problem. But I will say in my own work, I use a tool called Perplexity. And one thing I'll do is when I see something that an influencer says, I'll copy and paste it. And then it's just about learning how to prompt it. So for Perplexity, and I like that one because they give you 10 to 20 sources right there that you can then click on and read yourself, which you have to do. You can't just rely on the chatbot. But you can put the claim in and say, assess the validity of this, only use reputable medical sites, don't use wellness sites, things like that. You give it guidelines, and you can quickly at least start to judge whether these people are saying is accurate or not. And then if you want to learn more, as I said, go to the source material. Don't just rely on what's spit back at you. But that is a good tool that I think could help combat some of this misinformation, because people can get a succinct analysis and then actually do their own research and go through and read some of the source material.
That's actually something, man, that's a topic for another day. But I worry, right now, as of this recording, AI, despite hallucinations and mistakes, generally attempts to pull real information. If you ask pretty much any AI, even Grok, about whether vaccines work, it's going to give you, generally, it's going to say, yes, they do. But I really worry about someone deciding that AI is too woke. And then AI is, you're already seeing Elon try to do this, right? To retrain AI to give the kind of answers we want it to do. I worry that in a few years it won't be that reliable. But right now, yeah, to your point, things like Perplexity, basically anything that allows you to check and consume multiple sources and assess the validity of those, especially those that are reputable, is better, right? AI is great if you understand that, like humans, it's fallible and you don't just take whatever it says to the bank, right? You get a second opinion. Sometimes you ask the AI in two different ways to see if it gives you two different answers, and it might, right? It makes mistakes. Once you can accept that and work around that, it's actually quite useful. You just have to understand it's fallible.
Exactly. And that's why, again, I use Perplexity, because the sources are right there. There's every extra step is a barrier to entry for people. So if you're using OpenAI, if you're using ChatGPT, it doesn't give you the sources unless you ask, and people aren't going to get there. So I like the fact that I can see them in a row, and then I can look, and then I can go through and read the ones that I want. So unfortunately, we're just in an environment where people do have to check claims, because there are reputable media sources that are doing good work, but it's just so overwhelming. So if you're going to make a decision based on health, which is sort of the area that I specifically work in, take the time to understand what you're doing. Don't just listen to the person on the screen.
Well, Derek, thanks for coming on, and thanks again for Conspirituality. I know that podcast, like I said at the beginning, was a beacon of light for many people, and I know, especially in your original spaces, it was nice to have, a group of well-spoken, well-researched people assuring the listeners that they weren't completely crazy. So what are the best ways to obviously subscribe to Conspirituality? I think that's the number one no-brainer that people should do. What else, if they want more of you and your co-hosts?
Conspirituality.net is our site. Yeah, we're on every podcast provider. And I'm at derekberes.com, and everything that I do is linked from there. So wherever you happen to, I spend most of my time on Blue Sky. I think it's the best current social media app. But everything else I do, and sort of appearances, I will be debating Dave Asprey about seed oils in November at a conference in Florida. And I believe I'll be debating a holistic dentist about fluoride at that conference as well. So I do have some events that I do publicly. I was asked to be at TEDx Portland next year as well to speak about this. So I do some public events, but most of my online stuff is at derekberes.com.
All right. I suggest a throat punch, the double leg, the pass the guard, the go to mount, and then just ground and pound into oblivion.